I am 74 years old, and until the autumn of my 68th year, I believed I had already lived through the worst thing life intended to do to me. I had buried a son. I had buried my own father, and then, 20 years later, my mother, in the same week, as if she could not bear to outlast him even in memory. I thought grief had already taught me everything it had to teach. I was wrong. Grief had only shown me its gentler face. The other one was waiting for me in my own kitchen, on a Tuesday morning, in the shape of a phone left carelessly unlocked on the counter while my wife of 41 years went out to the greenhouse to check on her orchids. My name is Elias Whitcomb. I tell you this story now, sitting in the same leather chair I have sat in every evening for 30 years, not because I want your pity, but because I want you, my grandchildren, when you are old enough to read this, and perhaps a few of you who are old enough already, to understand something about what it means to build a life, and what it costs when the person beside you has been quietly dismantling it the whole time you thought you were building together. The saplings. I should tell you first what I built, so you understand what there was to lose. And to tell you that, I have to go back further than my own life, back to a spring morning in 1958 when my father, Thomas Whitcomb, stepped off a train in this valley with 11 apple saplings wrapped in wet burlap and a promise from a bank that he later told me he was certain, even as he signed the papers, he would never be able to keep. My father was not a sentimental man, but he told this story to me so many times over the years that I came to know it the way you know a hymn you've sung since childhood, not just the words, but the exact shape of the silences between them. He had grown up on a failing dairy farm 2 states over, the youngest of 6 brothers, and had come west with almost nothing because a man he'd met in the army had told him about a valley where the soil held water in a way that made the old-timer suspicious of it, as though good land were a trick rather than a gift. He bought 40 acres on a slope too steep for the big commercial growers to bother terracing, land nobody else wanted, because nobody else believed a man could get equipment up that grade without breaking an axle. My father did not have equipment. He had a mule, a shovel, and 11 trees, and he planted every one of them by hand over 3 days in April, sleeping in the bed of a borrowed truck because he hadn't yet built anywhere to sleep. He was wrong that the bank would ruin him. He was wrong about a great many things in his life, my father. He was wrong about my mother's illness in 1971, insisting for 2 full years that rest alone would cure what turned out to be a heart condition that nearly took her. He was wrong, badly wrong, about my older brother Daniel, whom he pushed so hard toward the orchard that Daniel left for the city at 19 and did not speak to him again for a decade. But he was never wrong about an apple tree. Not once, not in 60 years of grafting and pruning and standing in the rain at 4 in the morning during a frost warning, checking the temperature of the soil with his bare hand because he did not trust the thermometer as much as he trusted his own palm. I took the orchard over when I was 26, the year he died of a stroke in the same row of Aesopus Spitzenberg trees he had planted as a young man, found by a hired hand at dawn with his hand still resting against the trunk of the tree nearest to where he fell, as though even in his last moment he had reached for something solid to hold on to. I was not ready. I want to be honest about that. I had spent my 20s assuming I had another 20 years to learn everything my father knew, and instead I inherited 600 acres. The orchard had grown by then, slowly. Tree by tree and purchase by purchase, with a grief so raw I could not walk the eastern rows for the better part of a year without weeping. But grief, I have learned twice now in my life, is a poor excuse for letting something die that still has the capacity to grow. I learned the business the way my father had learned it, slowly, by failing, by losing an entire season of Ashmead's kernel to a fungus I did not catch in time, by nearly bankrupting the operation in a bad year in my 30s before I understood how to hedge against a poor harvest. By the time I was 50, the orchard supplied 3 states with heirloom varieties nobody else in the region had the patience to grow. I built a cidery in a converted barn that my father had used for equipment storage. I built a name. When people in this valley say, Whitcomb, they still mean an apple before they mean a family, and I have made a kind of peace with that, because the orchard was never separate from the family to me. It was the family. It was the thing we all stood inside of, the way you stand inside a church, whether or not you ever say a prayer in it. Delphine. My wife, Delphine, came into that life when I was 31 and she was 26, a schoolteacher from 3 towns over who had come to the valley to visit a cousin one autumn and stayed for the harvest festival almost by accident, the way you stay somewhere longer than planned because the light is beautiful and you have nowhere urgent to be. I met her at the cider tent, of all places, arguing, genuinely arguing, with real conviction, not flirtatiously, with one of my orchard hands about whether a northern spy apple was better suited to pie or to eating fresh off the tree. She was wrong, as it happened, about the pie. I told her so. She laughed, loud and entirely without shame, a laugh that used to embarrass me in public because of how much attention it drew, and I fell in love with her before the festival was even over. I should tell you that my first wife, Daniel and Margaret's mother, had died 3 years before that, a car accident on the county road during an ice storm, a death so sudden and so ordinary in its cruelty that I spent those 3 years believing I had used up whatever capacity I had for loving someone that completely, that a second love, if it came at all, would necessarily be a smaller, more cautious thing. Delphine proved me wrong about that too, the way she proved my father wrong about so many things without ever seeming to try. She did not replace what I had lost. She built something new beside it, patiently, the way you graft a new branch onto old rootstock, not erasing what came before, but growing forward from it into something the original tree could never have produced alone. We married the following spring in the same eastern rows where my father had planted his first 11 trees. Margaret, only 9 at the time and still raw with her own grief for her mother, walked down between the Esopus Spitzenberg trees carrying a basket of apple blossoms instead of flowers, because Delphine had insisted. This was who she was, in those years, a woman who understood instinctively how to build a bridge between a grieving child and a new life without ever forcing the crossing. I loved her before I understood what loving someone for 40 years actually asks of you. I loved the idea of her, I think, the way young men often do, the laugh, the conviction, the way she made a place that had become heavy with my father's death and my first wife's death feel, for the first time in years, like it might be allowed to hold happiness again. And then, slowly, over decades of harvests and frosts and the raising of Margaret alongside 2 more children we had together, I came to love the real woman underneath the idea. Or so I believed. I want to be honest with you about that belief, because the story I am about to tell you only makes sense if you understand how completely, how unquestioningly, I believed it for 41 years. There was a hard season in her 40s, an illness, the details of which do not matter here except to say that it was long and frightening and that I sat beside her hospital bed for 11 consecutive nights, and that we came through it together in a way that I believed, afterward, had bonded us more permanently than the wedding vows themselves had. I tell you this not to make what happened next more painful in the telling, though it will, but because I want you to understand that this was not a marriage of convenience gone stale. This was, by every measure I knew how to take, a marriage that had been tested by real loss and real fear and had held. The phone. The morning it began, I was looking for nothing more than the number of our accountant, Warren, whom I intended to call about the season's tax filing. Delphine's phone was on the counter, unlocked, because she had been using it to look up something about her orchids not 5 minutes before. She had, in recent years, developed a passion for growing them in the small greenhouse I'd built her as a 50th birthday gift, and she spent nearly every morning of that final autumn out there, humming to herself among the humidity and the strange, patient blooms. I am not a man who reads his wife's messages. I want that understood. In 41 years, it had simply never once occurred to me to look. But the accountant's number was saved in her phone as well as mine, and so I opened her contacts, and the messaging application was already open beneath it, and there, I did not go looking, I want to be clear, it was simply there, the way a fallen tree is simply there in a road you did not expect to be blocked. There was a name I did not recognize. Julian Cross. And beneath it, a message sent that very morning, at 6:47, while I had still been asleep upstairs. Miss you already. Tell Elias whatever you need to tell him. I'll be here. I want to tell you that I felt my heart break in that instant, the way it does in the stories. It did not. What I felt, standing in my own kitchen with my wife's phone in my hand and the smell of coffee still in the air, was a very quiet, very total stillness, the same stillness, I would realize only later, that comes over an orchard in the hour before a hard frost, when every leaf goes motionless and the whole world seems to be holding its breath, waiting to find out how much damage is coming. I scrolled back. I am not ashamed to tell you I scrolled back for over an hour, standing at that counter, while my wife tended her orchids 40 yards away, humming, unaware. What I found was not an affair of a few stolen weeks. It was a second life, built with the same patience my father had once used to coax a stubborn graft into bearing fruit that was entirely its own, slow, deliberate, cultivated over years rather than snatched in a moment of weakness. Julian Cross was a retired contractor in the next county who Delphine had met, the messages made clear, at a garden symposium 6 years before. 6 years. I had thought, in the 6th year of whatever this was, that we were simply an old married couple settling comfortably into the second half of our lives together, that the quiet contentment I felt in her presence was mutual, was shared. She had been in Julian Cross's house on the Tuesdays and Thursdays she told me she spent volunteering at the county library, a lie so small and so domestic that I had never once thought to question it in 6 years, because who questions a lie that small? Who suspects their wife of 40 years of anything more scandalous than being generous with her time? There was more. There is always more, in these situations, and I have come to understand that the second discovery is always worse than the first, because the first at least has the mercy of shock to soften it. The second discovery, you receive with your eyes fully open, already knowing how much it is going to hurt before you even read the words. Delphine had, over the past 4 years, been quietly transferring funds from our joint accounts that held not only our own retirement savings but a portion of the orchard's operating capital, money set aside every autumn for the next season's grafting stock and equipment, into a private account Julian Cross had helped her open. Nearly $230,000. Enough, I understood with a cold and specific clarity, standing at my own kitchen counter, to have funded the renovation of Julian Cross's farmhouse, visible in 3 separate photographs Delphine had sent him with captions calling it, in her own words, our little dream, finally coming together. I scrolled further, though every part of me by then wanted to stop. There were photographs of Delphine at that farmhouse, not scandalous ones, nothing crude, but somehow worse for their ordinariness. Delphine on a porch swing with a mug of coffee, her bare feet tucked beneath her the exact way she used to sit on our own porch on Sunday mornings. Delphine in a garden that was not our garden, kneeling beside a bed of tulips she had clearly planted herself, her gardening gloves, I recognized the gloves, a pair I had given her for Christmas 3 years before, smudged with dirt from soil that was not our soil. A framed photograph on a mantel that was not our mantel, of Delphine and Julian Cross at some kind of small gathering, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, her hand resting on his arm with a familiarity that made my chest go tight in a way no words in any message had managed to. I set the phone down exactly where I had found it. I went outside, and I walked the eastern rows of the orchard alone for the rest of that morning, the way I used to walk them with my father when I was a boy and something had gone wrong with the crop that I did not yet have the vocabulary to understand. I did not cry that day. I want you to know that, not because I am ashamed of tears, I have cried plenty in my life, at both of my parents' funerals, at my son Daniel's bedside in his final year, but because what I felt that morning was not yet grief. It was something colder and more clarifying, an emotion I did not have a name for until much later, when I finally understood it was the particular, specific stillness of a man realizing that an entire chapter of his life had been a story he was not, in fact, the author of. What I decided. I did not confront her that day, or the next, or the one after that. I want you to understand why, because I think it is the part of this story that matters most, more than the betrayal itself, more even than what came after. I am a man who has spent his whole life tending things that take years to show you what they truly are. An apple tree does not reveal in its first season whether it will bear good fruit or bad. You wait. You watch. You do not cut down a tree in anger after one disappointing harvest, because anger is a poor gardener, it moves too fast, and it takes with it things that might yet have been saved. I had learned this lesson from my father 1,000 times over 1,000 seasons, watching him walk past trees that other men would have condemned, running his hand along a branch that looked half dead and pronouncing, with total confidence, that it would bear fruit again within 2 years if we were patient with it. He was right more often than he was wrong. I decided, standing in that orchard on the worst morning of my adult life, that I would not become, at 72, the kind of man who forgot everything he had spent a lifetime learning simply because the wound was his own for once, instead of a tree's. So I waited. I watched. I went about the ordinary business of the harvest season, which that year was, cruelly, one of the finest we'd had in a decade. The Esopus Spitzenberg trees my father had planted in 1958 producing a crop so heavy the branches needed extra staking, as though the orchard itself were determined to mock the timing of my discovery with its abundance. I let Delphine believe nothing had changed. I kissed her good morning. I asked about her orchids. I do not know, to this day, whether that was cowardice or strategy, and I have come to accept that it was probably both. I called my daughter Margaret first, your mother, some of you reading this, or your aunt to the rest of you, who had left the valley 20 years before to become an attorney in the city and had never, not once in that time, expressed anything but a polite tolerance for Delphine that I had always assumed was simply the ordinary friction between a daughter and a stepmother, since Margaret's own mother had died when Margaret was 9, 3 years before I met Delphine at all. I understood, hearing the particular lack of surprise in Margaret's voice when I told her what I'd found, that her tolerance had never been about ordinary friction at all. I always wondered, Margaret said quietly, over the phone, from her office in the city, why she was gone so often on Tuesdays. I used to think it was none of my business. I think now I was protecting myself from having to think about it. We built the case together, my daughter and I, over the following 6 weeks, Margaret handling the legal architecture with the same careful patience I had once taught her to use when grafting her first apple branch at age 11, standing beside me in the eastern rows with a knife too big for her small hands, and me handling the quieter work of documentation, of dates and photographs and bank statements, gathered not in anger but in the same methodical way I had once tracked frost patterns. Across the orchard 600 acres to know exactly which rows would need protecting and which could be allowed to take their chances. Margaret brought in a forensic accountant, a sharp, quiet woman named Priyanka Osei. I mention her name because I think she deserves it, for the thoroughness and the discretion with which she did this difficult work, who traced every dollar Delphine had moved out of our joint accounts over 4 years, down to the last transfer, a document nearly 40 pages long by the time she finished. What we found, in total, would have been enough to end most marriages 3 times over. $231,400, moved in increments small enough that I had never once noticed them individually, the way you do not notice a single leaf falling until you look up one day and realize the tree has gone half bare. But I want to tell you what I decided to do with all of it, because I think it says more about the man I hope to be remembered as than the discovery itself ever could. The harvest. I did not humiliate her. I want that understood clearly, because I know how these stories are usually told, the wronged party staging some grand public reckoning, some dramatic unveiling at a party or a dinner table, designed as much for an audience's satisfaction as for the truth itself. I had no interest in an audience. I had built a life out of patience and precision, and I intended to end this chapter of it the same way, even though some small, wounded part of me, I will admit this to you, because I think it is important you understand I am not made of stone, wanted very badly, for a few weeks, to make her feel even a fraction of the humiliation I had swallowed alone in that kitchen. On the first Sunday of October, the week of the Harvest Festival, Delphine and I had hosted at the orchard every year for 3 decades, the same festival, in fact, where I had first met her, though I did not point out that irony to her that evening, because it would have been cruel and I had already decided cruelty was not the tool I wanted to use. I asked her to walk the eastern rows with me after the last of the guests had gone home. She came willingly, humming, entirely unaware, and I understood, watching her walk ahead of me between the Esopus Spitzenberg trees my father had planted the year before he died, that this would be the last evening in which she believed she had gotten away with something. I told her everything I knew. Calmly. Without raising my voice, without theater, the way I would describe a diseased tree that needed to be removed before the blight spread further into a healthy row. I told her about Julian Cross, about 6 years, about $231,000 of our children's inheritance quietly funding another man's dream house 40 minutes away. I told her about the photographs, the porch swing, the tulips, the gloves I had bought her for Christmas. She stopped walking somewhere around the third sentence and stood very still between two trees, her face going through several expressions in quick succession: shock, then something that might have been shame, and then, finally, something quieter and sadder that I think was closer to relief. I have thought about that look many times since. I believe some part of her had been waiting 6 years to be caught, the way a person carrying something too heavy is almost grateful, in the end, when someone finally takes it out of their hands. She did not deny it. I think, in the end, I respected that more than anything else about how the conversation went. She had at least the honesty, once caught, not to insult me further with a lie. "I was going to tell you," she said. "Eventually. When the time was right." "There is no right time to tell a man you have spent 6 years building a second life on the back of his," I said. "There is only the time you get caught, and the time you don't. I never stopped loving you, Elias," she said, and her voice cracked on my name in a way that, 40 years ago, would have undone me completely. "It wasn't about you. It was about something in me that just went quiet, somewhere in my 50s, and Julian made it loud again. I don't expect you to understand that. I don't need to understand it," I told her. "I only need you to understand what happens next." I told her that Margaret had already filed the paperwork, quietly, through channels that would not become public until she had already had time to prepare, because unlike her, I did not believe in ambushing someone I had once loved simply for the satisfaction of watching them fall. I told her the joint accounts had been restructured that week. I told her she would keep her half of what remained in those accounts, as the law required, but that every dollar traceable to Julian Cross's renovations would be recovered through the courts, and that the orchard itself, the 600 acres, the cidery, the name my father had built with 11 saplings and a stubborn refusal to fail, would remain entirely, solely mine, protected by a trust one had, in fact, quietly established the week I found her phone, naming Margaret and her siblings as sole inheritors, closing off any question of Delphine's claim to land that had been in my family for 3 generations before she ever set foot in this valley. "You planned all of this," she said, "while I was standing right next to you every day, not saying a word." "Yes," I said. "The same way you did, for 6 years. I loved you," she said, "and I believe, even now, that some small part of that was true, the way it is possible to love a person and still betray them for 6 years, the way a tree can look healthy on the outside while something quiet and untreatable eats away at its roots underground, invisible until the whole thing comes down in a storm that seemed, to everyone watching, to arrive without warning." "I know," I told her. "I loved you too. That isn't the part one can't forgive. What remains?" Delphine moved out before the frost came that year, into a small rental in town while the divorce proceedings ran their course, before finally, I heard, moving north to be closer to Julian Cross's farmhouse permanently. I heard, through people in the valley who still speak to me more than they speak to her, that she married Julian Cross 18 months later, in a small ceremony at the farmhouse our money had helped restore, though by then every recoverable dollar had, in fact, been recovered. Margaret had seen to that with the same relentless precision she brought to every case in her career, and I understood watching her work that some of my father's stubbornness had passed down through me and landed undiluted, in her. I do not think of Delphine often anymore. I have found, in the years since, that the particular grief of a late-life betrayal fades differently than the grief of losing someone to death. It does not soften with time so much as it simply becomes a fact you carry, the way you carry the memory of a hard frost that took half a crop one bad year. You do not forget it. You simply learn to plant around it, to build your seasons in a way that accounts for the damage without being ruled by it forever. There were harder months than I have let on here, if I'm honest with you. The first winter after she left, I spent more evenings than I care to admit sitting exactly where I am sitting now, in this same leather chair, wondering whether 41 years had meant anything at all, or whether I had simply been a comfortable arrangement she tolerated until something better presented itself. Margaret drove up most weekends that winter, sometimes bringing your mother, some of you, I mean, depending on which of my grandchildren end up reading this, and I remember one particular night in January when the two of us sat up until nearly 2 in the morning, and I finally allowed myself to say out loud the thing I had been too proud to say since October, that I was afraid I had spent 4 decades being a fool, and that the fear of that was worse, somehow, than the betrayal itself. Margaret said something to me that night I have never forgotten. She said, "Dad, you weren't a fool for trusting her. You were a good man who believed the best about the person he loved. That's not the same thing, even if it feels the same right now." I have turned that sentence over in my mind many times in the years since, and I have come to believe she was right, though it took me longer than I would like to admit to fully accept it. I am 74 now, as I said, and the orchard is thriving in a way it has not thrived in a decade, because I have found, in the years since Delphine left, an energy for the work I thought I had lost somewhere in my 60s. I replanted the western slope that second spring, an entire 10 acres of new Ashmead's kernel grafts, work that kept my hands busy through the worst of the grief in a way that talking never quite managed to. Margaret visits every autumn with her own children now, and I have taught 3 of you to graft your first apple branch the way my father taught me, the way I once taught your mother, in the same rows where I walked alone the morning I first understood what my marriage had actually been. There is something almost unbearably fitting, I have come to think, in the fact that the orchard, the thing Delphine's betrayal nearly cost me the operating capital to protect, became the very thing that healed me. My father would have found that funny, I think, in his quiet way. He always said the land gives back exactly what you put into it, eventually, even if it takes longer than you'd like. I tell you this story not so you will pity an old man, and not so you will think less of the woman who was, for a very long time, a kind grandmother to some of you before the truth of things came out. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something my father tried to teach me long before I understood it myself, that the things worth building, a marriage, an orchard, a family, a name, are built the same way. Slowly. With patience. With the kind of care that does not announce itself, that simply shows up, season after season, whether or not anyone is watching. And I want you to understand this, too, because I think it may be the most important thing I have learned in 74 years, that when someone betrays that kind of patient building, the answer is never to burn down what remains in anger. The answer is to prune with a steady hand, save what can still be saved, and trust, the way my father trusted 11 wet saplings wrapped in burlap on a slope nobody else wanted, that what grows back will, in time, bear fruit of its own, even sweeter, perhaps, for having survived the frost. The orchard is still standing. I am still standing. That, in the end, is the only ending to this story that ever mattered to me.